Motivation and drive are not mystical forces. They are not reserved for a chosen few. They are biological processes, systems embedded in our brains and bodies that can be understood, influenced, and optimized. When we talk about increasing motivation and drive, we are talking about modulating neurochemical and physiological systems that influence how we perceive effort, how we initiate action, and how we sustain focus toward meaningful goals. Let's begin by looking at what motivation actually is. Motivation isn't about feeling good all the time. In fact, the neurobiological systems responsible for drive are most engaged when we're pursuing something that feels just out of reach. It's the pursuit, not the attainment, that drives the system forward. Dopamine, the molecule most closely associated with motivation and reward, isn't released when we get the reward. It's released in anticipation of the reward. And even more importantly, it's released when we make progress toward a goal, not necessarily when we reach the goal itself. There's a common misconception that dopamine is just about pleasure. That's not accurate. Dopamine is about pursuit. It's about craving, about desire, about the willingness to undergo effort to get to a desired endpoint. This understanding is crucial because it gives us a framework for how to cultivate more of it. If you want to increase motivation, you have to increase the anticipation of reward. That anticipation is where dopamine lives. Now, how do we actually do that? One very effective mechanism is to learn to reward the process, not just the outcome. There's good data to show that when individuals attach positive emotion and internal reward to the act of striving, to the effort itself, the brain responds by increasing baseline levels of dopamine. Over time, this leads to increased capacity to stay engaged, persist longer, and avoid distraction. This has powerful implications. It means that when you do something challenging, something that requires effort, you want to consciously mark that moment with a sense of internal reward. That doesn't mean celebrating superficially. It means telling yourself, this is what growth feels like. This difficulty I'm experiencing is literally the process of my brain and body adapting. That simple reframing triggers the release of neurochemicals that strengthen your motivation circuitry. Another key element is visualizing progress. The brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly calculating how far we are from our goals and whether the effort is worth it. If you can visually track your progress, even if the progress is small, the brain registers that as success. This perception of success, in turn, releases more dopamine and increases your desire to continue. Whether it's a checklist, a calendar, a habit tracker, or a simple daily log, track progress visibly. This alone can significantly increase motivation. There's also an important role that the autonomic nervous system plays here, specifically the balance between alertness and calm. Drive is highest when we are in a state of heightened alertness but not in a state of stress. That's a fine balance. Too little activation and we feel lazy or unmotivated. Too much and we feel anxious or overwhelmed. One very effective way to increase alertness in a controlled way is through deliberate cold exposure. A brief cold shower or immersion, ideally under 2 minutes, can significantly increase norepinephrine and dopamine levels for several hours. This creates a natural state of heightened drive and focus without the jittery effects of stimulants. Sunlight is another natural and powerful tool. Early day sunlight, particularly within 30 to 60 minutes of waking, helps to synchronize your circadian rhythm and boost morning cortisol, which is essential for feeling awake and motivated. Cortisol has been demonized, but it's not inherently bad. In the morning, it acts as a natural alertness signal. When it's released at the right time of day, it sets the stage for higher motivation and better cognitive performance throughout the day. Sleep is the foundation. There is no amount of cold exposure, supplements, or mindset tools that will compensate for poor sleep. When we are sleep deprived, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, goal setting, and delayed gratification, loses efficiency. At the same time, the limbic system, which drives impulsivity and short-term reward seeking, becomes more active. This imbalance leads to procrastination, low energy, and poor motivation. So before looking for hacks, ensure that sleep is optimized. 7 to 9 hours per night, consistent wake and sleep times, and minimal light exposure in the late evening are essential. Then there's the topic of nutrition. What we eat affects motivation in profound ways. Amino acids like tyrosine and phenylalanine are precursors to dopamine. Eating protein-rich meals, especially early in the day, can provide the raw materials your body needs to produce these neurotransmitters. That's why breakfast or the first meal of the day, if you fast, should contain a good amount of lean protein. Not only does this support dopamine production, but it also stabilizes blood sugar, which helps regulate mood and energy. Hydration is often overlooked. Even mild dehydration can lead to fatigue and decreased cognitive performance. When the brain detects a drop in hydration status, it reduces alertness and motivation as a conservation strategy. So staying hydrated isn't just about physical health. It's about mental performance and drive. Exercise is one of the most reliable ways to increase baseline dopamine levels. Regular physical activity, particularly intense aerobic or resistance training, creates lasting changes in the brain that make us more resilient, focused, and motivated. There's a growing body of literature showing that the more consistent someone is with exercise, the more robust their motivation circuitry becomes over time. But perhaps even more important than physical exercise is cognitive friction. Deliberately doing hard things trains the brain to overcome resistance. Every time we push through mental or emotional discomfort, we are rewiring our circuits. One of the best things you can do to increase motivation is to cultivate a habit of doing something slightly difficult every day, something you would rather avoid. This builds neural resilience. Over time, your threshold for effort increases, and what once felt difficult becomes manageable. There's also a psychological component rooted in meaning and purpose. When people don't feel motivated, it's often because they don't see how their actions connect to something meaningful. The brain is always asking, why does this matter? When you link your tasks to a larger purpose, even if the task itself feels mundane, you recruit deeper systems of motivation. You're no longer just working on a spreadsheet, you're building a skill, you're moving closer to a long-term goal. That frame of reference activates the dopaminergic systems in a more sustained and profound way. Social connection also plays a role. Human beings are wired for affiliation. When we feel part of a group, when we feel seen and supported, we're more likely to take action. We are social learners. Seeing someone else work hard, especially someone we respect or identify with, activates mirror neurons and often increases our own drive. This is why accountability groups, mentorship, or even working in shared spaces can elevate motivation. It's not just psychological, it's biological. There's one more tool worth mentioning: deliberate novelty. Novel experiences, learning something new, or taking a new approach to an old task can trigger the brain to release dopamine. The brain is naturally curious when you introduce novelty, whether through a new setting, a new playlist during work, or a new challenge. You give the brain something to latch onto. That can reinvigorate motivation, especially during long periods of routine or burnout. The final layer is about how we talk to ourselves. Self-directed language matters. The way you interpret your own behavior can either reinforce or inhibit drive. Saying, "I have to do this," signals obligation and drains motivation. Reframing it as "I choose to do this because" gives you agency. That slight shift changes the neural interpretation of effort, which in turn changes how the task feels. Language literally shapes physiology. So when you feel unmotivated, it's not a personal failing, it's a signal. Your biology is telling you something needs adjusting. Sleep, light, nutrition, movement, novelty, purpose, or internal narrative. And the beautiful thing about motivation is that it's self-reinforcing. The more you engage in effortful action and reward the process, the more your brain builds the circuits for persistence and drive. It's a loop you can enter at any time. You don't need to feel ready. You need to start, however small, and then reward that start. Over time, the system becomes more efficient. You begin to trust yourself. You begin to enjoy the work, and you stop waiting for motivation to arrive because you've built the mechanism yourself. You've become the source. Motivation, at its core, is not just about doing things we like or find stimulating. It's about engaging the systems of the brain that create readiness for action, even in the absence of immediate reward. That's a crucial distinction because often what separates high performers from everyone else isn't that they feel more motivated, it's that they've learned how to act in alignment with long-term goals regardless of momentary feelings. They understand how to engage their internal reward systems even in the absence of external validation. One of the most practical tools for increasing motivation is goal segmentation. The brain does not respond well to abstract, distant goals. A goal like get in shape or build a business is so broad that it doesn't provide enough granularity for the motivational circuits to activate. The dopaminergic system prefers specificity. It thrives on achievable, clearly defined milestones. If you want to train your brain to stay motivated, you must break down large ambitions into discrete, actionable steps. Each time you complete one, your brain gets a small hit of dopamine, reinforcing the behavior and creating momentum. There's a term in neuroscience called microgoals. These are extremely small, almost trivial tasks that are nonetheless steps in the direction of a larger goal. When you're struggling with motivation, microgoals are invaluable. They allow you to move from a state of inertia to a state of progress. For example, if the goal is to write a chapter of a book, the micro goal might be to write one sentence, just one. It may seem insignificant, but neurologically, the transition from 0 to 1 creates a state shift in the brain. Once that shift occurs, further effort becomes easier. You begin to enter a flow of action. Dopamine release increases, and your sense of identity starts to shift from being someone who is stuck to someone who is moving forward. This links closely to what is known as the psychological momentum effect. Once we experience success, even small success, our perception of our own capability increases. The brain uses this perception as evidence for future behavior. It says, "I've done this before, so I can do more now." And because the brain is a pattern-detecting organ, it starts to look for evidence that you are consistent, that you follow through. That internal narrative becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is why starting with something small and doing it consistently is not just about discipline, it's about changing the story your brain tells itself about who you are. Another critical aspect of increasing drive is the use of mental contrasting. This is a process where you vividly imagine the desired future state and then contrast it with your current reality. What this does is create a cognitive tension, a kind of internal dissonance that energizes behavior. When done correctly, this tension drives you to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Unlike purely positive visualization, which can sometimes pacify the brain into thinking the goal has already been achieved, mental contrasting maintains the motivation to act by emphasizing the distance between now and the desired outcome. What's fascinating is that the brain interprets this tension as a challenge rather than a threat when we pair it with a plan. So, visualization by itself is not enough. You have to couple it with what researchers call implementation intentions. These are if-then plans. If situation X arises, then I will do behavior Y. For example, if I feel tired after work, then I will still go to the gym for at least 20 minutes. When the brain has a preloaded script for behavior, it reduces the cognitive load of decision-making and increases the likelihood of follow-through. You're essentially automating discipline. Another driver of long-term motivation is meaning assignment. Human beings are meaning-making machines. When we connect our tasks and efforts to something we perceive as valuable, we activate deeper neural circuits, including those associated with empathy, purpose, and long-term reward. This is particularly important in careers, creative work, or relationships. When motivation wanes, one of the most effective interventions is to ask, "Why does this matter to me?" and then go one layer deeper. Not just because I want to succeed, but because succeeding will allow me to care for others, or because it aligns with the kind of person I aspire to become. The prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for executive function and long-term planning, is highly responsive to this kind of deep meaning assignment. It becomes more active when we attach personal value to our goals. In this way, motivation becomes not just a matter of willpower, but of alignment. The more aligned your goals are with your internal values, the less resistance you feel in pursuing them. The actions begin to feel congruent with who you are. There is also growing evidence that novelty and variation can reinvigorate drive, especially during periods of stagnation. When we engage in the same routines over and over, the brain habituates, dopaminergic tone declines. That doesn't mean we need to abandon routines. It means we need to inject novelty into them. Something as simple as changing your environment, altering the order of tasks, or trying a new learning modality can reignite neural activity. The brain likes surprises, positive surprises specifically. They signal that something new is happening, and this releases dopamine, which boosts motivation. That said, variation must be balanced with consistency. There's a concept called stability, plasticity balance. The brain needs a certain amount of stability in routines to operate efficiently. Too much unpredictability can create stress. But small, controlled doses of novelty, what researchers call bounded uncertainty, optimize the system for engagement and exploration. This is part of why travel, new challenges, and learning unfamiliar skills often leave us feeling more motivated and alive. There's another tool often misunderstood that can significantly enhance drive, stress. Not all stress is bad. Acute stress, when managed properly, can increase performance. It releases adrenaline and cortisol, which increase energy, focus, and reaction time. The key is how we interpret that stress. If we see it as a threat, it shuts us down. But if we see it as a challenge, it primes us for action. This is the basis of what's known as the challenge response, a stress reappraisal technique. Instead of interpreting increased heart rate and nervousness as signs of anxiety, we can tell ourselves, my body is getting ready to perform. That one shift in interpretation changes the hormonal cascade and increases motivation to engage. Breathwork is another powerful lever. It provides a direct pathway into the autonomic nervous system, allowing us to modulate arousal states in real time. A specific breathing protocol that has been shown to increase alertness and readiness is the physiological sigh, 2 short inhales through the nose followed by a long exhale through the mouth. Just 1 or 2 cycles can reset the nervous system, reduce stress, and increase clarity. This is particularly useful before difficult tasks during fatigue or when dealing with mental blocks. You're using the body to regulate the mind. Hormonal balance also plays a crucial role. Testosterone, for example, is not just about aggression or sexuality. In both men and women, it's closely linked to status, seeking, risk-taking, and motivation to compete. There are natural ways to support healthy testosterone levels, including resistance training, adequate sleep, healthy fats in the diet, and sunlight exposure. Low testosterone correlates with low motivation, so maintaining hormonal health is a foundational aspect of long-term drive. Another less discussed but highly effective motivator is contribution. When we realize that our efforts impact others, we're more likely to take action. This is wired into our biology. Social species, including humans, evolve to cooperate when we serve others, whether through mentorship, leadership, or simple support. Oxytocin is released. This hormone promotes bonding and emotional warmth, but it also increases dopamine when paired with effort. Helping others in this way becomes a self-reinforcing motivator. It makes us feel needed. It gives context to our efforts. Journaling, particularly structured journaling, can also increase drive. One specific method involves writing down 3 things each morning, 1 goal for the day, 1 obstacle you expect to face, and 1 way you will overcome it. This primes the brain to anticipate and overcome resistance before it even arises. At night, reflecting on what you accomplish, even if it was just staying consistent, further reinforces the identity of being someone who follows through. This strengthens the neural pathways related to motivation and self-efficacy. And then there's the often ignored realm of digital stimulation. The modern environment is saturated with rewarding stimuli like social media, short-form video, instant messages. These platforms hijack our dopamine system. They train the brain to expect high levels of reward for minimal effort. Over time, this desensitizes us to the dopamine released by effortful tasks. Things that once felt stimulating, reading, studying, building, now feel dull. The solution isn't to eliminate technology, but to create what's called dopamine balance. Spend more time earning dopamine through effort and less time consuming it passively. Over time, your motivation for meaningful tasks will return. Delayed gratification is a muscle, and like any muscle, it can be trained. The more you delay shallow rewards in favor of deep progress, the more your brain learns to value the climb rather than the immediate payoff. That is the essence of true motivation, not just chasing short bursts of pleasure, but building the endurance to pursue something long after the initial excitement has faded. And it's this endurance, this capacity to continue, that separates fleeting inspiration from sustainable drive. Neuroplasticity is at the heart of sustained motivation. It's the brain's ability to change itself in response to experience, and when properly leveraged, it becomes a powerful ally in building long-term drive. Every time you push through discomfort to pursue a meaningful goal, you reinforce a neural circuit. Each repetition of effort under challenge increases the efficiency of that pathway, making future effort feel more automatic. This is how habits of discipline are born, not in moments of inspiration, but in repeated exposure to challenge followed by follow-through. The brain doesn't care much about your intentions, it learns from what you do. Action changes the brain far more than thought ever could. There is also a deeply biological connection between movement and motivation. Physical activity, especially intentional and vigorous movement, stimulates the release of dopamine and other neuromodulators that influence focus, mood, and drive. The act of moving forward, even physically, sends a signal to the brain that you are engaged in pursuit. This is deeply ingrained in our evolutionary wiring. Our ancestors who moved were the ones who survived. The neurological circuits that governed pursuit of prey are closely related to the ones we now use for pursuing goals. Walking, running, lifting weights, all these behaviors activate brain areas responsible for forward movement, both literal and metaphorical. Sleep is another cornerstone. Lack of adequate sleep reduces dopamine receptor sensitivity, making it harder to feel motivated or experience pleasure from effort. Sleep also impairs the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, reducing your ability to plan, resist impulsive behaviors, and stay focused. This makes it harder to delay gratification and stick with long-term goals. One of the most underrated tools for increasing drive is simply to protect your sleep architecture. Go to bed and wake up at consistent times. Avoid blue light in the evening and minimize caffeine after midday. These small behavioral shifts have disproportionately large effects on motivation. Nutrient status affects motivation as well. Your brain requires certain micronutrients to manufacture dopamine and serotonin, key neurotransmitters involved in effort and reward. Tyrosine, for example, is an amino acid that serves as a building block for dopamine. Magnesium, zinc, and vitamin B6 are all cofactors in dopamine synthesis. A deficiency in any of these can create a physiological block to feeling motivated. The food you eat doesn't just fuel your body, it's also feeding your brain's motivational machinery. A well-regulated blood glucose level is also key. When blood sugar crashes, so does your capacity for focus, energy, and sustained effort. The goal is metabolic stability, eating in ways that support energy balance and cognitive clarity. There's a behavioral principle known as the activation energy threshold. This is the amount of energy required to initiate a task. For many people, this threshold feels high for anything involving effort or delayed reward. But the threshold doesn't stay fixed, it changes based on how you structure your environment. One of the most efficient ways to lower this threshold is to reduce friction. If you want to read more, place a book where you can see it when you wake up. If you want to exercise, lay out your clothes the night before. These seem like trivial steps, but they signal to the brain that action is expected and easy. The lower the activation energy, the more likely it is that you'll take the first step. And once that step is taken, motivation often follows. Social dynamics also play a central role. Human behavior is contagious. When you surround yourself with people who are motivated, focused, and committed, you begin to mirror their behaviors unconsciously. This is due to mirror neurons, specialized cells in the brain that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else doing it. These neurons help us internalize the habits and attitudes of those around us. So, if you're serious about increasing motivation, examine your environment. Who are you spending time with? What values do they reinforce? What behaviors do they normalize? Motivation is not just an internal process, it is shaped profoundly by social context. There's also a psychological component called locus of control, which refers to whether you believe that you are in control of your life's outcomes. People with an internal locus of control believe that effort, choices, and persistence determine results. Those with an external locus attribute outcomes to luck, fate, or other people. The more internal your locus of control, the more likely you are to take initiative and sustain action. Fortunately, this belief can be trained. Each time you act with agency, each time you make a plan, follow through, and see a result, you reinforce the belief that you have control over your life. This sense of control feeds back into motivation. The brain loves feeling like the actions it takes matter. One practical technique to build this sense of agency is to end each day by reviewing what you did well, what was within your control, and how your actions influenced your outcomes. It doesn't need to be dramatic. Even noticing that your decision to go for a walk improved your mood reinforces the idea that your behaviors have power. This, in turn, increases your readiness to engage in future effort. Another essential layer in this discussion is identity. Identity is the story you tell yourself about who you are, and it governs your behavior more than rules, systems, or schedules. If you believe you are a person who always quits, that belief becomes a behavioral pattern. If you believe you are someone who keeps going no matter what, that too becomes a self-reinforcing loop. The key is that identity is malleable. Every time you do something that's aligned with the identity you want to have, you make it more real. This is why it's powerful to say not just I'm going to the gym, but I'm the kind of person who trains consistently. Behavior shapes identity, and identity reinforces behavior. The connection between attention and motivation is also crucial. What you focus on expands. The brain has limited attentional resources, and how you allocate them determines your emotional state. If you focus on everything that's going wrong, you'll feel defeated. If you focus on progress, on what you've done right, even if it's small, you begin to generate optimism. Optimism isn't blind positivity. It's the belief that effort will lead to improvement. That belief is essential to sustaining motivation over time. You train your attention through practices like gratitude journaling, goal review, or simply asking yourself at the end of the day, what moved me forward today? Directing your attention in this way teaches your brain to value effort, not just outcomes. Motivation is also tied to novelty, as mentioned earlier, but not just sensory novelty. Intellectual novelty, new ideas, challenges, and curiosities can reignite drive. When you feel bored or stagnant, it may not be a discipline issue. It may be that your brain is craving a new puzzle to solve. This is particularly true for high-performing individuals. They need to be stretched cognitively. If you're lacking motivation, ask yourself, am I growing? Am I learning? Sometimes the path to renewed drive is not to do more of the same, but to pursue a deeper or more complex version of your current goal. One overlooked tool in maintaining long-term motivation is rest. Not just sleep, but deliberate, restorative rest. The brain operates in alternating rhythms of focus and recovery. When we ignore the need for recovery, we burn out. Burnout is not a motivation problem. It's an energy imbalance. Strategic breaks, nature exposure, time away from screens, and unstructured time all allow the nervous system to reset. After rest, motivation often returns not because we willed it to, but because we restored the capacity for focus and drive. Sustainable motivation is rhythmic, not constant. Then there's the power of anticipation. When you schedule moments of reward, celebration, or acknowledgement for your progress, you create a future state for the brain to look forward to. This is different from relying on rewards to take action. It's about creating a sense of pacing. When the brain knows that effort will eventually lead to pleasure, it releases dopamine in anticipation, which sustains behavior through difficult periods. These rewards can be simple: a conversation with a friend, a favorite meal, a walk in a new part of town. But the key is that they're contingent on effort, not random. This keeps the dopamine system engaged in a way that reinforces meaningful progress. Visualization practices can also support motivation when done properly. The most effective visualizations are not purely positive. They include a contrast between success and the obstacles that must be overcome to get there. This activates both the reward centers of the brain and the planning centers. A well-designed visualization includes sensory detail, emotional resonance, and a clear plan of action. It's not about fantasy, it's about rehearsal. You're training your nervous system to get familiar with both the climb and the reward. This reduces resistance when the actual effort begins. Finally, there is the deep and often underappreciated role of belief. The belief that your actions matter, the belief that growth is possible, the belief that your past does not define your future. These beliefs are not fixed. They can be built. They are formed through repeated evidence, moments where you chose effort over ease, consistency over comfort, resilience over resignation. Every one of those moments sends a message to your brain: I am someone who can do hard things. I am someone who moves forward. I am someone who keeps showing up. And when that becomes your internal narrative, motivation becomes less about trying to get yourself to act and more about letting your identity guide your behavior. In the end, increasing motivation and drive isn't about waiting for the perfect moment or a surge of inspiration. It's about learning to work with the biological, psychological, and environmental systems that govern your behavior. It's about understanding how dopamine, effort, attention, and identity interact in the brain, and then designing your days in a way that supports momentum rather than stalls it. It's about taking ownership of the small habits that shape your neural circuitry and committing to consistent action even when it feels uncomfortable. Motivation isn't something you find, it's something you build through movement, focus, sleep, nourishment, meaningful goals, and a mindset oriented toward growth. And as your brain adapts to that pattern, what once felt like a struggle becomes second nature. You don't just chase progress, you become the kind of person who creates it.